Good evening and welcome again. Tonight we continue our conversation with the man who's been described as the most trusted man in America, the one and only Walter Cronkite. Welcome back.
Good evening, Tim.
Lots of discussion on this program about the media, the role we play in society, and some of the pressures against us. Story last week, 60 Minutes, was going to do a story on tobacco. And we're basically forced not to do an interview because they were afraid of being sued. Is this a troubling trend?
Sure, it's a troubling trend. It's this commercial use of commercial pressure, dollars and cents, to intimidate the press is just as serious as any other form of intimidation of the press. And it's something that I would like to think, for heaven's sakes, that people who are responsible, owners of broadcasting and print medium, would resist. They ought to know which side they are buttered on in this democracy of ours. They don't. Those who permit such pressure to be exerted clearly are thinking purely of their pocketbooks, thinking of that alone, not of the people's right to know or the people's necessity to know. And I abhor it.
And you would hope that the owners of the new networks, or the new owners of the networks, would stand up and say, sue us if you have to. We're going forward.
Certainly I'd like to think that might happen. I think I've been around long enough to not be terribly sure it is going to happen that way. It's a shame that this should be happening, because I was able to make a claim after 20 years of doing the evening news on CBS that not once did we ever suffer commercial pressure that was relayed from those in authority who might have been the subject of that pressure, never relayed to us on the news desk. I never once was asked to leave something out, put something in because of a commercial interest in the broadcast. I'm sure, and I heard many times from people in our business department, that they had come under such pressure. They'd had calls from advertisers, good clients of theirs, spent a lot of money with us, who said, what in the world is he doing that kind of a story? The thing he did last night doesn't help us a bit type thing. They never relayed it to us. They may have relayed it to executives of CBS News. I wasn't executive. I was a managing editor and broadcaster of the CBS Evening News. But the executives, the top area, if they heard from the business department. Never once told us. They were our defense line, and they said, I'm sorry, we don't do business that way.
If Walter Cronkite had ever heard from a news executive about that commercial pressure, what would you have said to him?
I like to think, Tim, that I would say, well, it wouldn't bear.
This is cable.
Wouldn't bear. Well, even on cable, I don't think I'd like to get into the words I probably would use. I said, but let me point out, I say, I'd like to think that I would say that. There is a commercial pressure, I mean, a monetary pressure on the individual as well, clearly. Some poor kid at a local station who's got a wife and 2 kids and isn't making the kind of money that I guess you make today, that always comes up, doesn't it, these days? Isn't that lousy? I don't mean that. Well, I do mean it. You do make it. But
you missed the golden era, see?
All right, I did. Mickey Mantle, World War III. That individual, he's got a heck of a time telling his boss, well, I quit. If that's the kind of station you run, I quit. That's pretty tough. That's pretty tough. You don't know where that next job is and so forth. So, you know, it's the old Indian adage, unless you walk in the other man's moccasins. I haven't ever had to walk in those moccasins. So while I can say here bravely that I would quit, I'm not so sure that I would, and I think it's tough. I think what is necessary there, we have organizations, Radio Television News Directors Association, for instance, which is large enough, powerful enough to bring some pressure on owners, on an individual owner particularly. They could blackball a station if they felt strongly enough and were tough enough. They work at this. They snipe at this. They work around the edges. I haven't heard that they have ever said that. There will never be another person who works at your station, your news department, who will be accepted in the RTNDA. We could put that kind of a licensing procedure in any mention of licensing news people gets everybody's hackles up instead of mine. So I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about licensing newsmen by government or anybody else, but professional standards being applied in a form of membership. That if you're not a member, you can't get work.
You made a comment about journalists and the way we live and the salaries we earn. It has changed, hasn't it?
A lot.
At a time when you were working first with UPI, United Press, and then with CBS, journalists made a salary pretty much equivalent to what other folks in the community were making. How has that changed the way journalists function?
I think it's too bad, and I do want to make it clear that I can't claim that in my CBS later days, an anchor man, I was making what anything near top salary at UP or most newspapers. I was making quite a lot more than that. Nothing like the million-dollar salaries today, multi-million-dollar salaries. I don't think that it has any conscious effect on the recipients of that money. I think that Brokaws and Rathers and Jensen of this world, or Jennings of this world, or Stalls and others are just as conscientious as they've ever been about trying to do an honest job and they work diligently at it. They're all skilled news people and they achieve it most of the time. But there's got to be an effect in lifestyle. In the old days, before the heavy salaries, even salaries in newspapers today are lifting the big newspaper, the New York Times, Washington Post types, above the average salary level. But before World War II, in my days, United Press, early days, our salaries were roughly the equivalent of a fireman, a policeman, county court clerks. These were our economic equals. We might have been a little bit of, well, probably not. I was going to say ahead of an education. I'm not so sure that was true either, because it wasn't. In many newspapers, there wasn't anybody who had a BA degree on the whole staff, let alone a master's or a doctorate, as almost required today by some newspapers. So we weren't probably much better educated than those guys. We were journeyman news people. And those were our drinking pals. We got off work and we went down by the police station and at the press bar and grill, and we sat there with a bunch of cops and firemen, and these were our buddies. We understood budgeting. We understood the problem of making ends meet to family. We understood the problems of public transportation, for heaven's sakes. We understood what it was like to stand in line to buy something somewhere. Boy, we don't do that today. I mean, I'm talking about myself now. I don't stand in line anywhere. I know somebody in the front office. I call up their personal sales representative or whatever, and we go through. The limousine takes me there.
And that changes the way you look at life.
I don't have any concept, really, of what it's like to meet the daily requirements of life today. I don't know what it's like to stand on that bus every night.
We have to take another quick break. We'll be right back with more of Walter Cronkite right after this message. We're back talking with Walter Cronkite. We talked earlier about corporate pressure on, commercial pressure on some of the networks. What about political pressure? I've always wanted to ask you about the Vietnam War. When you came back home after reporting, put your commentator hat on, and basically said to the country, we're not going to win this war in Vietnam. What did Lyndon Johnson do?
I got on the phone right away.
Who did he call?
As you know, he did.
Yeah.
He did.
And he called?
He called Frank Stanton, the president of CBS, I believe. I think I remember this correctly. It may have been, no, it wasn't. Yeah. I think that was a routine at the moment. Now, not to me directly in that time. He went over my head. There were times when a couple of times, when he called directly to me, and I wasn't even off the air yet, and he insisted that they put him on right away. They had to say, Mr. President, he's still broadcasting,
Live television.
He's live, and he's on the air. But there were a lot of times when he might put off a day or two and then call his good friend, Dr. Stanton or his good friend Bill Paley, and indirectly put a little pressure on. This never again got down to me. As I said, the commercial pressure did. I'm sure that a lot of that happened. It got down to me, of course, when they called directly. And I got calls from the White House staff with always the introduction was, you know, some of us around here were thinking that. And you know good and well that some of us around there thinking that was the boss himself.
Right.
The subterfuge didn't it was only maybe gossamer thin. But only once, and again in the 20 years on the CBS Evening News, was I aware that political pressure had succeeded in any way. And that was when we did the Watergate story. We toward the latter part of October, with an election coming up, I was impressed with the fact that the Watergate story had almost disappeared from the front pages of the newspapers. It had trickled out, in a sense, from June, when the Watergate break-in took place, to that point. The stories had. There had been revelations, of course, the famous ones from the Post and the Deep Throat stuff, but they had petered out, as it were. Most of the revelations had come and gone, and the cumulative effect never really took hold. And I was concerned about that, because there was this terrible violation of democratic rights in the attempt to steal an election, if you please, and directed by the White House conspiracy itself. We couldn't let that thing die. So I suggested that, since we had not come up with any new revelations of our own inquiring reporters, as it were, I hate that phrase, we put the story together in an ABC fashion. What happened, who was involved, what they say, what to say. This ran quite a long time. Stanhope Gould, a fine producer of ours, put the program together. The first program, the first evening news, it was on the evening news, I think ran 14 minutes of our 23 minutes.
That's an eternity.
That's an eternity. We'd never, well, somebody told me once that a story ran longer when I made this claim. I've forgotten now what that story was. But at any rate, this was quite unusual. And Colson, Chuck Colson at the White House, called Paley and put real pressure on from the White House. Paley called Dick Salant, who was the president of CBS News. Salant, knowing full well that he would have an explosion on hand with his news people, led by me, if he said where the request came from, himself took the load and said, fellas, that was just too long. We have overbalanced the broadcast with one story. What are you planning for the next night? Because we're doing it in two parts. We said another 14 minutes. No, he said, let's not. How about 7 minutes? Let's cut it in half. Well, it turned out that Stanhope was terribly unhappy. I wasn't as unhappy as I thought. I thought it was still Salant. I wasn't quite as unhappy as he was, because I thought it could be cut. It turned out only later, we learned, weeks later, that Salant had held the fort for us by talking Paley into the fact, well, if we cut it in half, wouldn't that satisfy the White House?
We have to take another quick break. We'll be right back with more of Walter Cronkite. We're back with Walter Cronkite. Who's the most interesting person you've ever interviewed?
Well, I'd probably bring up a name that not enough people have heard, Athelstan Spielhaus.
Okay.
Funny, kind of a funny name, but Walter Cronkite shouldn't make fun of anybody else's name. He's a marvelous Renaissance man, a scientist of great knowledge in many fields, and just a delightful companion. And that's not what you want to hear. You want to hear some headline name that you can immediately recognize. I think that, gosh, that's very hard with all the people. I'm an admirer of Sadat's. I found him very interesting person, who was not thought of as one of the intellectuals of the colonel's revolt against Farouk, but succeeded to the job after Nasser died.
Who was the most difficult? Who was prickly that you almost had to do root canal to get an answer out of?
Oh gee, very probably, oh gosh, maybe Nixon, maybe Harry Truman. Harry Truman wasn't much interested in playing to the press.
At all?
At all, you know.
Nixon sometimes was, sometimes wasn't.
Yeah, that's exactly why it's so hard to say about any of them. Johnson, if he didn't want to play, could be really mean about it, as you know. And Truman wasn't ever mean about it. He just wasn't there. I mean, not intellectually, but I mean, as far as trying to reach him, we didn't have any contact with him. Nobody was, no press was really much in his circle.
We talk a lot in our business now, and your business, about mistakes we make and how we keep our credibility with the public by acknowledging our mistakes. You had one time talked about a news council where we would go and air our grievances and talk to our viewers about that.
I talked about it because I resisted it.
Right.
I was opposed to it.
Right.
This was Dick Salant, the president of CBS News, who was probably, for integrity, had more than most of us have in our little finger. An incredible man. Came to us from the law, too. I never believed that a man could come from another profession, particularly the law, and understand our business. But he did, even better than we. And he desperately believed in a news council and helped organize a news council at one time. It lasted only 2 or 3 years, partly because the New York Times would not participate, and without the leadership of the Times, why other papers didn't come aboard, and it never got enough support. The idea was that it would be an ombudsman for the public. Anybody with a beef against the press could come to the News Council and state their case. And the News Council, sort of as in a grand jury indictment, would take a look at the circumstances, and if the complaint was warranted, would then call in the newspaper and ask them to make amends in their columns about this matter. I tell you why that doesn't get off the ground and why I'm opposed to it. I don't think there is any way to legislate performance of this kind. Any attempt to do so smacks of censorship. You can talk about the News Council and protecting the broad base of it by selection of who is on the council and making your constitution in such a fashion that you have a fair representation of viewpoints. But the danger is always there, that a majority coalesces. And a majority can coalesce and begin to brand a newspaper for its performance or a network for its performance out of whatever form of peak, commercial, ideological, religious, whatever. You've got censorship. You've got a dangerous situation. And I think it impinges, or could impinge, the danger is sufficient enough that it could impinge upon our freedoms of speech and press, that it is not worth the gamble.
You have a minute left. What advice would Walter Cronkite give to some young man or woman who wants to be a journalist? What should they do?
Get into it. It's the greatest game in the world, no doubt about it. But learn something of the world other than studying journalism alone. And the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University is there, despite my edict in that regard, because there are those who wish to take it, and we've got a master's course for those who get a BA without any journalism courses, but we have the others as well. But learn what you can when you're in college of other disciplines, so that then you can apply some real learning to the rather easier profession of journalism.
Travel, learn a second language?
Oh, definitely travel. Second language, definitely. Third language today, if you could possibly muster that. Learn some English first, for heaven's sake. We need some English-speaking news people these days.
Quotations from Uncle Walter. We learn English. Thank you very much. It's been an honor having you on this program. You're an icon in our profession. Well deserved. We thank you, and we look forward to watching the Cronkite Reports on the Discovery Channel. You have one in December on family values,
Indeed.
and I hope you'll come back again soon.
Thank you.
Pleasure.